lens that it gives us of looking at the world actually gives us a shattered, fractured world. And it deals well with parts, but not so much with wholes, with linear causality, not so much with actually like living system feedback loops. And it's creating problems faster than we can solve them. And so therefore kind of its possibilities for a future seem to be dwindling, which can be pretty scary if that's the only frame of reference that you have. Like, it seems like a dead end tunnel kind of. But on the other side of this is actually an inflection point. New models that give new life, simple solutions to problems which seemingly before were completely intractable. And new space, new possibilities. Let's look at how this process works. I'm actually going to say one other thing here before we start this next piece, which is this is also part of our model for change. Like, what if you're going to try to change a system, I'd recommend you have some model for change, like some frame of reference for how it is that change actually happens. And we have a few different pieces of that. This next piece is going to be one of those pieces. So it has to do with addressing, we use a ladder as a metaphor, and it has to do with addressing both sides of the ladder, both rails of the ladder at once, where many things tend to not deal with this as a unity, but just deal with one or the other side. Like, we can go raise people's consciousness or educate people, and we can, but what tends to happen when you do that is that people have insights, breakthroughs, they get excited or whatever, and then they go back into their life, and some days, weeks, or months later, they're basically back to the things that are alive, the processes that they operate in their daily life, and the kind of inspiration tends to dwindle away, or the raised consciousness can dwindle away. I mean, who's had that experience with an epiphany, an insight, a breakthrough, like, wow, this is going to be life-changing, and then you're like, some months later, you're like, wait, what happened to my life changing? Because we also need embodied practical tools. Like, you can't only shift people's consciousness, it has to actually be embodied in their daily life practice, the things that we do, right? And so what we're suggesting is you have to you kind of like have to eke up the ladder a little bit, each side of the ladder, and you kind of can capture the ground that you've gained with building a bridge across the two rungs as a step in the ladder, as a rung in the ladder, in the forms of practical projects.
I want to say one thing real quickly, just this term embodiment that Arthur just used. We use this a lot, and I'm not sure it always lands exactly right. But the point about embodiment is that it's something that comes into existence. It's a form that is visible on the outside. It's a crucial thing to, as opposed to a consciousness thing, which is an experience that's happening internally.
Yeah, well, there's a shared artifact. There's something in shared space that it lives, not just in internal space. Cool.
Another way to describe that is there's something that you can see, hear, and notice that lets you know that was taken.
Exactly, and that the fly on the wall could see, hear, or notice as well, even if they can't read the font or whatever. All right, so then the process is you keep building on that process to produce change. So why did we lure you in here with language of paradigm shift, and now we're going to like talk about something else? What is this thing that's bigger than a paradigm shift and even more disruptive? The problem is we've never heard anyone else talk about it, so we don't really have language for it, but it also has to do with our change model and the way that we recognize that change on this planet has happened even before humans. Like, what are the big leaps of change? And so we're going to name it and distinguish it, but lots of people can feel it coming, even though we don't have a name for it. So as a whole, we don't have that language. So let's first talk about paradigm shift. So Thomas Kuhn, who was the person who introduced the term, identifies a paradigm shift as a significant change to the underlying assumptions of scientific models, right? We use it not just in science, but the whole idea there is that the old assumptions no longer work. you actually start seeing too many exceptions to the rules that you have to break out of that frame and make a new set of rules, right? And so one of the common examples is, like, in terms of scientific model, the sun is in the middle of the solar system, not the earth, right? That was this supposedly really big paradigm shift. But if you look at it, the mathematical models they had with the earth in the center were pretty darn accurate. It's not like they were confused about where the planets were when or that kind of thing. They did a pretty good job of modeling all of this with all these epicycles and all that kind of stuff. And although the Copernican revolution is considered, well, revolutionary, life on Earth did not notice that revolution that much. The rabbits, the trees, the squirrels, the grass didn't so much notice this argument Copernicus was having with the church, right? And so we're talking about something that's a little bigger than that style of revolution. So, for example, life on Earth noticed the arrival of DNA, right? Like, that changed from single cell life to multicellular complex organisms, right? That changed everything. People kind of agree that that's a game changer, the arrival of DNA, or organic compounds, or nervous systems, or language, or writing, or the printing press. That those things fundamentally shifted capacities on the planet. And you may not all have some shared models about this, like language, writing, and printing press, but many people associate writing with really the agricultural revolution and like what it was, how it shifted our worldviews, how it shifted our relationship to nature, how it shifted realities, how it shifted the kinds of social structures and how they can scale. You basically can't run the Roman Empire without writing, right? Like there's a coordination problem that happens on scale. And the industrial age was basically given by the printing press. That was the first little factory making books, right? And so these things did shift life on the planet to the point that we are now threatened with some of the situations that we're in. So we're calling these things a fundamental shift in capacity, in particular, coordinative capacity, the ability for many things to coordinate. Like DNA changed the coordinative capacity of cells. Does that make sense? That's right? What we don't tend to recognize, because of our view of evolution that sort of places us on the top of this evolutionary ladder, we don't tend to recognize that evolution never stops there, right? We are also cells in social organisms that have their own patterns of intelligence distinct from our own human intelligence. And sometimes this is a tricky concept to grasp, but I would assert a corporation, an institution, a government is an organism. It is a social organism. If you look at the definitions we have for organisms, it basically meets them all. There's self-preservation instincts. It can spawn offspring. It has its own patterns of behavior and intelligence, even as the cells within that system are replaced, right? Even if you get somebody into power, if you can get a CEO into the seat of an oil company who declares, the future of our company is renewable energy, not oil. And as they're trying to make that shift, or as she's trying to make that shift, if the quarterly profits fall short of projections, how long will she remain CEO? There's a pattern there that is perpetuating itself, even against the people in power that might want to change it. That pattern is encoded, and there's certain capacities embedded in that. And so anyway, we're saying that the patterns that we use to coordinate are the place where system change must happen. And that's what a capacity shift is about. So they emerge from the quantum leap, a fundamental shift in the at this point in time, 11 years ago, we called it expressive capacity of a system, but it also has to do with receptive capacities. So we now call this grammatic capacities because it's both, the coordination is both the act of producing and receiving, right? The coordinative signals.
And there's just a tiny little bit on that, is that the way we look at grammars is that grammars are not about language. Like DNA is itself a grammar. So it's grammatics is the best language we have for that. But this is the key thing, is how do we discover new grammatics that are these new capacities? Because that's the lever of change. It always has been on the planet, and it seems in the universe. And because each one of these things, language, neurons, they are grammars that bring, via the expression in that grammar, they bring new things, new entities into life. And so it depends on what kind of grammar you have, what kind of entities can come into life. And so if what we're talking about is coordinative capacity and social organisms that live a different way, that don't live the way the ones we have to have a new grammatics that underlies those social organisms.
I kind of actually want to pause for a moment. We're about to go into another thing that is going to bridge to Lucy's topic about the language of currencies as the tools for embodying the language of living systems. But before we do that, I kind of want to pause for a second and just like hear, is this making sense? What's showing up? Can you start to imagine some different, like this could potentially introduce some different ground to stand on than, the next token liquidity pool or whatever. Like let me get a temperature check, actually. I want to introduce a concept here of a temperature check. Who's played video games? Let's start with that. Who's played video games? Have you ever played a video game where a character had particular status? Let's say Sims, right? There's these little bars over their head about like their hygiene, how dirty they currently are, or how much energy they have. Or we're going to do a status bar over our heads right now. So this is low, this is high. And so the question is, who is are you seeing some kind of opening here? Is this actually starting to open a glimpse of something? And we'll charge on forward, but I want to get a sense of who's seeing like huge opening, who's like, why are they going on about paradigm shifts and capacity shifts and all this is sort of empty words so far. Like somewhere on that spectrum, where are we? Everybody got a status bar? Okay, super useful for me. Thank you for
Echo's got two bars.
Yes,
what are the two bars representing?
I think there is an even bigger opening after that opening, but that's maybe that kind of room.
So then, perfect. Pecco always has the twist, and so Pecco's rating the next opening as big, but this one as still small. So
What is the paradigm shift of the bigger than paradigm?
It's not in the sense of kind of competition. It's not in the sense of kind of competition. It's more that this paradigm shift has a consequence of kind of chain of events that is probably a bigger paradigm shift. Like in a sentence, it comes to a point where we realize that we are living upon our own designs. Therefore, our fiction and our creation is actually the major basis of our living and behavior.
perfect. Which is part of why what we put this forward as an invitation to start telling a new story and have a new place to stand in these things that we're building, rather than just try to do tweaks on what's known.
So there's like a cascade of paradigm shifts that come as a consequence of this conscious design about the patterns that we use to coordinate.
Sorry, it sounded like you just finished.
No, I mean, I can.
It's just we're trying to get the mic to people because the online people, this is the sound for them. So even though we might be able to hear each other in the room.
So there's a cascade of potential paradigm shifts that happens when we can become conscious designers of the patterns that we use to coordinate, instead of just using what's automatic, but to make actual choices and decisions about which pattern and tool we're going to use to coordinate our attention and energy together.
So we're briefly showing this. We're actually going to come back to this in much more depth because this is a little glimpse of what we call a living systems model of wealth. And there's different currencies that operate in each of these different spheres and different characteristics of each of these spheres. But all living systems have these dynamics. And we miss most of these dynamics with how we currently run our economy. And so we'll come back to a better and deeper view on this. But what I want to drill into right now is the larger outer circle of the evolutionary capacity of systems. All systems, all living systems have the ability to change and evolve, right? And so the expressive capacity shift or the grammatic capacity shift actually is shifting at this biggest outer level that the change ripples through to all of the other levels, because this is the space of possibility for the organism, or in this case for humanity. And so big change starts out there and then rearranges everything at the other levels. And so a quantum leap in expressive capacity actually fundamentally structures all those other inner dimensions. But like I said, we'll drill into this in a minute as we start to give a framework for exploring Lucy's topic. So this was an invitational event where we were inviting people to participate in the Metacurrency project. So, okay, so why isn't this just a paradigm shift? Because the problems aren't just conceptual at this point, they're structural. And the solutions are about engaging with the living systems around us, not just changing our way of thinking. And if we don't know how to engage with the living systems, we can't actually be regenerative, right? Like you were talking about earlier, there's a lot of sort of regen washing beginning to emerge. It doesn't mean we actually know how to be regenerative. So think about it this way. What's the difference between these two issues, two types of problems, a heart attack or a mistake on a math test, right? In one case, you might be able to just alter your conceptual frame and address the issue. In another case, you might want to do something else, right? And we are essentially having a planetary heart attack, right? We have converging problems at this point that I would assert are all symptoms of the economic engine that we're using to eat the planet. But we actually have to address fundamentally the imbalance that's emerging from all of these converging issues. And there's more. That was just the ones that I thought of in the middle of the night when I was making this Prezi. So I just want to point out, these are not breakdowns in just ideas and models, although they may have emerged from that. They are now actually system problems, more like the heart attack in terms of the planet. So they're actually a problem in the running living systems. The vital functions of the planet are starting to fail. So realistically, this is a domain where the cells in our body exhibit more intelligence than we do. Again, we fancy ourselves at the top of this evolutionary ladder, and yet when it comes to things like communicating, collaborating, sharing scarce resources, building what you need out of what you have, large scale coordination, those kinds of things. It's like we get stuck in traffic trying to commute to work. Like we're really actually not very good at this stuff. And we have a lot to learn to actually grow useful coordination. They speak a language that we haven't yet mastered. And what we're trying to do is kind of open up a tool set as a possible glimpse into this language, because our survival depends on it. Now, after saying all of that and dissing the paradigm shift, I do want to go back for a moment and define the paradigm shift that I think that we're in, because I think that it actually also supports the conversation of why currencies are what matters here. I think we're actually moving from a scientific paradigm to a systems paradigm. I'm going to characterize the scientific paradigm as object-centric. Like what we're really good at is objects banging into each other. Like we can launch rockets to the moon. We can launch nuclear missiles at each other. We're good at manipulating objects. And not only that, but our language if you think about most living languages today, they're basically like subject, which is an object, but it's the object with agency in the sentence, followed by a predicate, which is usually a verb and more objects, and maybe prepositional phrases, which always start with a preposition and an object. We're basically stringing objects together. And if you kind of play that game out of relating to the world in that objectified manner to its like ultimate extreme, you sort of get Western scientific, reductive materialism, like we kind of have, right? Where everything's just an object. And yet, on another level, we also so far see very little evidence that there are any objects, right? We drill atoms were supposed to be that smallest indivisible thing. It's like, oh wait, no, there's electrons and protons and neutrons. Oh wait, no, there's quarks and quarks of different types and all the, the subatomic particles. Like we keep drilling down and we keep calling them particles. We keep acting like they're objects. But it starts being funny when you start naming your particles like charmed and left and right and up and down. Those no longer sound like objects. Those sound like processes or flows, that kind of thing. So as near as I can tell, as we drill down, we find there aren't any objects. There's always just patterns of flows. And so the systems paradigm is about patterns of flows, and that's generally typically out of scope with scientific paradigm. Scientific paradigm doesn't go well into that territory. It makes little forays. I guess I want to say one other weird thing, because we're speaking English right now, and we keep playing language games with English. Like I'm talking about current Cs. Most languages don't happen to have a convenient word that we can play with like that, where currency is different than money. And so I can say, great, money is a medium of exchange, but we're interested in currencies and seeing the flows and coordinating flows. But what's interesting also in English, we tell a strange truth here with the scientific paradigm, because the word science comes from the same root as schism, schizo, scissors. It means to cut or separate. And I think part of what we are all experiencing is some of the pain of separation from the scientific paradigm, the alienation from each other, from nature, from ourselves. It's always in this frame of treating everything like an object. And if everything is just an object, it's basically dead. You have separated yourself from it. You're no longer empathically, relationally woven in and connected with it, and we keep trying to remove that connection and reach objective empirical things, and I'm sorry, now I'm getting on a little soapbox, but I find it a little crazy that we know this to such a degree that it's like, we know that the placebo effect affects scientific studies anywhere from 40 to 55-ish% effectiveness out of something is like moved by the placebo effect. So you have to have it be a blind test. Well, first of all, we had to provide placebos, because if you didn't provide the placebo, then it made this difference. But you then have to have it be blind, and then now you have to be double blind, because even if the doctor knows if they're administering the placebo or the thing or the real drug, now that affects it another 5 to 15%, and there's now even processes for triple blind type stuff, because even if the people observing the study know the differences, that affects the outcome. And meanwhile, a medicine is considered to be effective if it moves that needle statistically 5% or more, where we already know the placebo effect moves it, when you start adding up the different blinds, right, somewhere between 40 and 70%. So it's like disconnecting ourselves and acting like it's just objects, not that we're like relationally woven in, is a little crazy. And we've somehow all bought that craziness. All right. That was a soapbox detour. So thinking from creating a fully composable language of flow, we ended up having a major breakthrough in the technology. And this is where we stop, right? Because this goes to Scepter, and we're not talking about Scepter. But the point here is we rebuilt, we made the whole computing communications currency stack using the patterns of living systems. And actually, you could say from the feminine instead of the masculine, from the receptive capacity. And I think this is where we switch to.
Maybe a final thing to say, well, we can go into this one if we want, but I think the part of the point of this from where I'm standing is that we've been at this for what now, almost 10 years, 11 years, 15 years. And we're trying to share with you the frame that we're standing in because it feels like it actually makes a difference to what the outcome is. And that's the offering here. And I think we would also like feedback on that. And what frames are you standing in, and how is it that the frame we're standing in will actually make a difference to what this thing ReFi looks like? What is the Fi part? And I think part of the reason why we boldly said we want to take up some time here is that it feels like a lot of that stuff is actually not standing in a new frame. And how can we together really stand in a different frame where different effects come out because it's a new place? So that's the invitation.
Yeah, like we built something called Holochain out of this frame. And now we had to call it something chain so that people could, I mean, it uses hash chains properly and that kind of thing, but so that people could actually see it as in the same problem solution space as blockchain, but it's built from living systems frame of reference. So it doesn't have any of the same scalability problems and everything because it just comes from the frame that nature operates on scale, for example. So when you step into a different frame, you arrive at very different patterns. And yeah.
Now we don't know for sure that we got it right. Our frame may actually be off, but we think it makes significant difference.
Yeah, it's at least a significant upgrade.
I mean, all I can say is that this framework of thinking has also guided design stuff that I've been doing even outside of Holochain, and I can definitely attest to like just the way of thinking, like agent-centric approach, but also like about flows and stuff has deeply changed the way I view how we can even use DeFi and how we can use like finance.
I'd love to speak to the sense of convergence, considering that like I bumped into you, Eric, because although I have not been in coordination with you guys whatsoever, I'm definitely in the same space of like, how can we take a look at and make conscious awareness around patterns so that we can make choices that completely change the entire, the space, right? What becomes possible to sense and see and observe and do as a result of that. Anybody else?
I guess I've been also thinking a lot, and I'm sure a lot of people here, and that's how we got here, is how to change or have an effect on patterns. In my experience of trying to break or shift some of my own patterns, I feel like so much of this is not just conceptual or cerebral, it's somatic. So how do you see us being able to integrate some sort of somatic element in all this, because it is so heady, and sometimes it's weird that I have a body now because our lives are so virtual. So do you have any ideas around how, I mean, even in your definition, you kind of say like digital. So where is the body in this? Or does anyone have any ideas?
I'm hesitant to go into answering that, but you are making me think that I would love if we could actually take a pause and do kind of a partner thing where you take a minute to actually come up with like a question along these lines, not that question, but like, what intractable problems are you looking at that you wonder whether this actually can support or shift, or provide, remember I said it provides simple answers to previously intractable problems. And so would everybody be game to do that for a minute? Actually just like pair up and come up with kind of one of the questions that you've been having and remember it so that we can actually bring it forward later. And then can we address that one a little bit later? Sweet. So let's take a minute, or take a couple minutes and do that. Can everybody just pair up and,
We had one hand up, Arthur. Hold on a second.
oh, sorry.
Is it good? Hello, hello. Um, so, like, it's a really interesting framework looking at it. One of the things, though, that I think, well, just to say, the framework definitely shifts a bit, like your mind and how you're viewing, like, wealth and how you're viewing resource and the currencies, and I think that's really interesting. One of the things that I think is missing that I didn't really see in the framework, or is anything about power relations and how those are like very like when you talk about patterns of the economy, like if it were me, if I were giving this presentation, I would just say it is the pattern of capitalism. Personally, like I would say that we are, like, I think in, like, within a Marxist framework, a lot of these things can fit in particular things that already is in that particular history. If we think about, like, capital is like a social reproducing system and has a pattern to it, and that pattern is, like, you can describe it as, like, you know, MC, I'm M prime, Marx view. Capital is basically just something that you have the explicit intent to make a profit off of, and that sort of pattern is continuous to capitalism. And what's really interesting, you described the economy as an engine, as did Marx did. So it's really interesting because it's about, because, you know, I would say that capitalism is this, like, extractive system that is based on a power relation between, you know, people who own wealth and people who don't own wealth, people who have to sell their labor in order to survive. So they would be stuck in your framework here, like under tradable wealth, under scarcity. If you're stuck in that part, the only thing you have to sell is your labor. And so you are stuck in this power dynamic where if you don't have tradable wealth, then you have no wealth, and therefore you, like, do not survive in the economy. And then you have, maybe you could say that a capitalist is in, you know, the either measurable or rankable wealth, and therefore because they're in that position with more wealth than others, in which they have that security, that economic security, they are able to have this power dynamic over people who are only in maybe the tradable wealth part of this framework. So I think it's interesting that maybe by avoiding using these more politicized terms that I'm using, you are able to, like, shift it a bit and get to people who are less or who are more sensitive to, like, politicized topics. But to me, I think, you know, it would be interesting to know about what you think about, like, power relations specifically that are repeated within the economy, as, like, I think the patterns that you're talking about, like, that's what comes to mind for me.
Thank you. That's a really great question. The question I'm hearing is, where are power relations inside this kind of grammatics? I think that's a really valid and powerful question that we need to talk about.
Actually, just let me give one little sales pitch for the evolution of economies one session that's going to be after lunch, because we will actually address capitalism and kind of leave the whole frame behind, actually. But yeah.
In terms of power relations, I challenge us to think about the nuclear family, because we do tend to extract and talk about the economy and these systems, but at its base level, what we tend to often ignore is these relations and our incentives within the nuclear family model, or even what we have now, which is a lot of us may not be living in nuclear families. We live in a completely different lifestyle, and we relate to each other in a very different way. And that small unit level is I feel like worthy of being looked at and needs attention in order to then draw it out and see how that pattern and kind of leads us to act in certain ways in a larger and larger society.
I think I'm good for now.
Does anybody else have a medium burning question or a question that's not relevant that they don't even know if it's relevant? But I'd love to hear it to see where we are in different scales. Who wants to bring that question?
Thanks. So kind of as disclaimer, very new to the whole framework, so which is kind of a lot to take in for somebody kind of new to this. But you know, as we were talking, and it actually it's a question that was triggered by Jessica's question when she was talking about the body, and I was thinking about what about the kind of basic human needs, which is kind of very linked to the kind of living system, but ultimately to, I mean, whatever terminology is going to be wrong, but operate on this planet and survive, we need food, we need clean water, and all of those things. So I was just kind of trying to kind of make sense of this kind of very kind of conceptual framework, and how do you then kind of link it back to kind of that sort of like survival stuff that we need kind of to continue to exist. So, but it's very difficult to frame it. That's why I kind of put it down, but they're like, put it up. So we had an interesting start.
Yeah, the question I was exploring was, how do we factor in human emotions and the fact that we're not rational actors in building systems like this? And how do we, if we choose to, like codify virtuous expressions versus non-virtuous expressions in our systems? Do we want to incentivize love for your neighbor, love for the environment versus greed and fear? And how do we factor that in systems design?
Want to answer, or okay? So I like how you put the paradigm change part, the kind of coming from a science paradigm to a systems paradigm. I particularly like it because it's almost like a recognition of a meta level, because science was already a systems paradigm, but a particular one. And going towards a system paradigm is more like realizing that this is just one system among the potential infinity. And but the one point I wanted to bring in this is, if we go towards systems paradigm and towards flow, as you put it, how do we start approaching how we define this in terms of how it flows forward? That is, if we make a definition, how its main role is not to say what is, but its main role as a definition as what does it do? Like what kind of operation it engages. And you're certainly not unfamiliar with this, like in the sense of producing hologen and other projects. Those are engines, so those are very much about what do they do. That's the primary purpose. But I'm also thinking in terms of when we talk about these things, or when we define these things, when we have a discourse around these things, how does that move more to the realm of doing, being operational, not just definitional, not like a stone block with noble letters on it, but actually a driving force in and of itself, a part of the process as well.
So when you say, how do we define flow as in doing, are you talking about like, how do we define the flow and what it does, or how do we embody it?
That's actually a good example. Our like common drive is, when we have this thing that is flow, is how do we stop it? How do we build a bracket around it? How do we make it dead, that we can look at it and observe it? Which is, how do we define things? And in a way, I'm not saying that is wholly bad. There is certain use for such an operation. But if that's the main operation, and then we're happy when we have defined it, that it's made it dead, then something is missing. So how do we move the emphasis towards, okay, we made something out of it. How is that something an engine? How is the definition actually a driving force, not a dead object?
I got something you want to. So what I want to share something that to me feels like it's common across all of the sharings that I just heard here, and especially ending with what Pekka just said. So to the question of power, to the question of families, to the question of local needs, to the question then of doing, for me, this approach, the thing that we're trying to do is live into a world in which we understand the actual dimensionality of what's there, so that we can, and this is the part that's the thinking, the conceptual stuff, it's so that we have a template space in which you can then create expressions that lead us to act inside that space. And if we get the dimensions right, then we have more ability to act and be inside that space, whatever it happens to be. Whether it happens to be the space of power, the construction of family, the relation to how we live and gain the resources for sustenance. And so that's what I think this is about, and where we'd like to do is an offering in what the dimensionality looks like, that if we actually had grammatics, we understood the parts of speech. This is kind of what we're saying. We're offering, these are the parts of speech of well-being, wealth, weal, which it would be the way in which we as humans can interact with the living ecosystem that we're a part of, so that we're acting correctly across the dimensionality. Then we'll be able to act healthily rather than destructively. And I think that with that kind of grammatics, like actually thinking from that position of grammatics, then we can actually say, okay, what are the grammatics of human relation in familial structures? Because the nuclear family is very modern. What are the grammatics of power? And what are the tools that we use that then shift relations of power because we're using those tools? And so part of the reason why we don't talk about power is because there's a big question in my mind of which is wagging the tail. Are the power relations that we see living into have to do with the fact that we use actually monetary currencies almost entirely? And that is the embodied form. So the embodiment, the social body is almost entirely monetary. It's financialized. And if you have that, then what are the outcomes of power that exist that way? And so for me, one of the largest levels of power is to say, oh, what is the grammatics that were in place here? What can be spoken inside that grammatics? And then there'll be completely new power relations as a result. This is why we're saying our model of change, our theory of change, is about grammatics. What is the grammar that exists? Now, does that mean that we have to navigate power as it exists right now and pay close attention to it and pay close attention to privilege and all of these things? Absolutely, 100%. That's how we figure out what the dimensionality is in which we can create new grammars that will actually speak new ways of being into existence.
I'm trying to figure out, should we go into more of these questions? Should we actually distinguish this a little bit? Because it's been up there and mostly people are kind of like making up what it means. Should we talk about that for a minute and come back, or are these burning? There were 3 hands up.
What do folks want? And then we do this?
Sean.
Okay.
So I think it's really important that we have a shared understanding of meaning around this term wealth, because I would question whether we could replace that with something like consciousness. So pretty much like replace wealth as a grammatical term there with rankable consciousness, highly conscious, less conscious, nameable different types of consciousness, and then the realm of possibility around consciousness. And that then brings us, I think, into an interesting intersection between consciousness and quantum shift, quantum mechanics, and so on. In terms of, for instance, just the quantum phenomenon that light is both a particle and a wave. I think that potentially gives us a thinking space and a connection that has both scientific basis in terms of quantum theory, as well as let's call it even spiritual experience of life, which is consciousness. And those are increasingly becoming closely connected. So for me, I think the one kind of sticking point I have with this resonating with me right now is maybe just around the meaning that we are attaching to a concept such as wealth.
Yeah, it's a really great point, because we did not note that we use 2 terms very differently than they're commonly used, although we use them sometimes without pointing that out. One of them is currency and one of them is wealth. And you've gotten my little shorthand for currency, but you haven't actually gotten the definition, which is a shared formal symbol system. Currencies are just symbols, they're information. Shared formal symbol system to shape, enable, and measure flows. Money is a shared formal symbol system that we use to shape, enable, and measure certain kinds of flows, typically exchanges of goods and services. There are many other types of currencies that we use to shape, enable, like a college degree is a kind of reputation currency that we use to shape, enable, and measure acquisition of knowledge in particular specialized domains. And then that feeds into, I mean, there's a whole bunch of these things. Wealth is another term. And in both of these cases, we are trying to sort of go back to deeper origins of the language, because currency comes from the Latin currere, to run, to flow, right? So we're trying to bring that focus back to currents and flows. Wealth actually comes from the same root as wellness. And you heard him say, or maybe you didn't because it doesn't make sense to anybody, but you maybe heard him say the word wheel a minute ago. That's an older Middle English construction where the words, like if you actually was a parallel to the word health, we have health and heal. Like to heal is to make healthy. It's the verb form of having the state of health. To wheel is to make wealthy. And we define wealth in terms of actually the collective's capacity for flow, right? To actually get the resources to where they're needed. And that becomes the wellness of the community, right? The commonwealth. Does that make sense? So we're trying to reclaim this language a little bit. And so when we talk about wealth, a living systems model, this is rooted in that collective capacity to actually create healthy flows and get things to where they're needed. Does that somewhat, at least, I mean, obviously it's different than consciousness, but is that on? I don't know, I don't hear you.
That actually, it would be consciousness. Like if you were in that state of wheel, I can only imagine that happens because of heightened consciousness. But then remember at the very beginning, the ladder with the two sides. So for us, this term embodiment, I know, Jess, you were talking about embodiment in our personal bodies, but that embodiment is that stuff that we can see on the outside. That's the collective embodiment, the creation of a collective body, so that that thing becomes conscious as well. And that's part of what's actually happening in here. It's that this is what we're aiming at and why it shows up there.
There's an interesting connection in the term that I've seen used a lot in metacurrencies in your work is abundance, and so the connection between the abundance of energy within the universe and how do we use the abundance of energy to create to fulfill our needs. So we have utilized parts of the energetic resources of the universe that we dig out of the ground, and we've used those to meet some of our needs. But we found ways now where we've replaced gold with Bitcoin. We digitalize it, we virtualize it, we create the energetic form of it, which brings new possibilities, but also is less extractive and so on. So it's about how do we tap into the potential of this abundance that is available to us and create new forms of meeting our needs that do not require us to dig into the limited resources that we're exploiting.
And also, before we move on too far from your contribution, I actually want to bring up what you said about light is a particle or is a wave, that actually the frame there is object-centric, and that I would offer from this grammatic capacity frame that light speaks both particle and wave. And so it seems like a particle when you're speaking mass protocols, and it seems like a wave when you're speaking electromagnetic protocols to it, because it speaks both of those protocols, but it isn't an object. It isn't an is of one or the other, right? Like these weird things start to get easy answers. Yeah. Did you still?
I just wanted to add one quick thing. So you're talking about grammar. It just reminds me of Marshall McLuhan and the media is the message. Like the forms that we use are exactly what's created. And this is very strong. I guess an example would be everyone uses the word user. Where did this come from? It actually means junkie, dopehead. And what are we doing? We're all dopamine. So I have over years been like, every time I hear that word, I try to bring it to the awareness that that's not really a nice word. And that is that really what we want to create? Way, even I'm listening to this conversation to reflect that I'm hearing engine, very industrial era language, like a totally different element. So being like thoughts become words, become actions. So I guess you don't want to become annoying about it. You know, you don't want to be in the person in the room, but just maybe even starting to shift. And I guess because I'm so language and saying the same thing, but how can we begin to just trickle in or just bring a light touch of awareness? Like what's the balance there between, you know, not being hyper OCD about our language, but also like allowing for some new possibility in the language that we speak?
You should sometime be a fly on the wall when Eric and I are actually deep in our compressed jargon. We're trying to use more accessible language here, but yeah. Yeah, yeah. Hang on, before we go ahead.
I think we should do this now.
Exactly, that's where I wanted to go. You wanted to start? You want to do it? So I just want to actually, yes, this levels of wealth. It probably should say dimensions because, like Josh, you were talking about it as if somebody had to get out of what, like it was a stage of development or something like that. These are dimensions that are all existing simultaneously and present in all living systems. So what I mean by that is it's like if Euclidean language makes it easiest to talk about. This is not exactly a Euclidean space, but if we pretend this direction is X and this direction is Y and this direction is Z, I can't be just stuck in the X dimension, right? Like I'm existing simultaneously in all three of those dimensions. And sorry, just a note. No, we're going to stick with this. A note about flow versus objects. But so all systems have all of these present simultaneously. All living systems have all these present simultaneously. You can think of these as dimensions of living systems. And yet, in a sort of Venn diagrammy manner, we have them getting larger because the influence and scope is so much larger of these other dimensions. So for example, I'm just going to use a human body as an example because we've all got one and we kind of know a little bit about it. And I'm going to get a little, it's going to seem funny to talk about it in some of the ways we talk about it maybe because we're used to focusing more like on human labor, but we've all got parts and products, right? And I'm going to look at mostly talk about the blood system here, or circulatory system. So if you have adequate nutrition, you can donate blood, or you can sell plasma or platelets, and you can actually extract this byproduct of your body, and your body will produce more, and that becomes a product of the body. Is that clear for everybody? Yes? But that blood also has certain properties, right? The most obvious, like basic ones are like blood types, right? Like blood is a tradable commodity. Blood types are not. We can't trade blood types. Hey, I'll swap you my A for your B, right? Like we can't do that. So the level science is pretty good here at this stuff, objects, and it's actually pretty good at properties and measurement. It starts to break down a little bit as we start to move here. We make little forays out to here, but we tend to translate them back to static properties. So this might be, for example, your blood pressure. How do we measure blood pressure? Pardon? Systolic over diastolic, right? We basically are measuring a flow. We like pump up a thing. We actually measure the pressures as a dynamic flow in that moment, and we translate it to two static numbers and act like it's that thing. But 5 minutes later, if you're angry or if you ate something really salty or if you are exhausted or depleted in some way, right? You could have a different blood pressure. Blood pressure is dynamic. It is not static like your blood type, right? And so there's different ways that things work at this level. I'm going to stop and back up for a second and just actually notice that we skipped a couple of the little words in there. For those that might not be able to read it from the back, the word scarcity in there. Our whole economy is modeled on scarcity. There's a reason for that. It's because we're using artificially scarce currencies. So all of the study of economics and the things that we think are true about economies are actually only true about artificially scarce economies. We don't even know the physics of non-artificially scarce economies. There's completely different dynamics available in those spaces.
Economies with enforced liquidity, the enforced liquidity of money versus tokens, the difference between money and tokens, and the moneyless tokens.
Right. So there's a whole bunch of other assumptions baked in there as well, like fungibility and liquidity and a bunch of other things and power dynamics that are all baked in. And later in the week, we're convening some sessions about the currency design space, the ontology and terms and all the knobs and dials that you can adjust on a currency. And it'll also be calling into question a bunch of those things that we take for granted right now about money. So right now, that's the only level that scarcity is even relevant, is in parts and products. You never have a scarcity of properties, right? I feel like I lost people a little bit about the economics of artificial scarcity. Is that, no? Sorry, let me just give one example because I feel like it hasn't quite landed. We talk about money as a measure of value, right? As a measure of value. But measures are never scarce. You never have run into, yeah, exactly.
My inches are all gone.
Yeah, you've never run across a construction crew that's sitting there on a pile of building materials that said, yeah, we had to stop work because we ran out of inches, right? Like, measures are not scarce. And so it's a lie we tell about money that it's a measure. It's actually units that are issued through particular power dynamics and rules, right? So anyway, we made it out to performance level, blood pressure. We gave that example. Oh, sorry. Let me just say one other thing. There are currencies that are relevant at each of these different levels, and we probably should talk about some of those. Tradable wealth, like the pints of blood, or any kind of embodied commodities, are tradable, right? By the way, dollars are not here, they're here. Most of the current economy is actually gambling chips. It's actually a speculative currency whose value is connected to betting on the market of the living systems. It's actually not part of the living system. It's an abstraction. That's why in this diagram, we're sort of trying to make the metaphor here of like water, ocean, and we're going into greater depths. And the current economy is like not even in the ocean, it's the dock, right? It's disconnected from it. Does that make sense? Which is part of the whole problem of why we actually cannot have regenerative finance from this frame, because you can't have the currency disconnected from the living systems because those living carrying capacities. And if you can just issue infinite currencies because you've currency to be in an exponential growth curve and it's decoupled from the feedback loops of the living system, then you've got the dock versus the ocean here thing, right? It's completely disconnected.